On a bright Sunday morning in Cedar Creek, a little Midwestern town where maples threw lacework shadows across the white clapboard church, the congregation spilled into the parking lot like a colorful stream of hats, suits, and floral dresses. And there in the center of the lane lay a dog that refused to move. A medium-large mixed breed with shepherd lines and retriever softness, perhaps 8 years old, with tri-colored fur, coal saddle across his back, tan legs, a white blaze streaming down a dignified muzzle whose whiskers had grown silver, his chest broad but lean, paws splayed like anchors, amber eyes steady and unblinking as cars idled and people paused. The dog's name no one knew yet, but his demeanor spoke of practiced patience and fierce purpose, ears pricked, breath measured, tail still, not wagging, not fearful, simply resolute like a sentry. And when a man in a blue sport coat tried to coax him with clucks of the tongue and the promise of a leftover donut, the dog didn't so much as flick an ear, only lowered his nose until it hovered over a small circle of gravel where sunlight shone like a pin on velvet. That circle centered something tiny and gleaming. A metal's ribboned clasp, half buried in dust, the metal disc itself face down, its edge catching light. The man said, "Funny, looks like a coin," but the old church caretaker, Mr. Blakely, late 70s, with a tobacco-weathered face and clean-shaven jaw, a retired tool and die worker whose steady hands had repaired pews and people's broken prayer boxes for decades, knelt to look closer and drew in a breath, muttering he hadn't seen one like that since his brother shipped out. And when he reached, the dog gave a low, polite rumble of warning. Not aggressive, more like an admonition to step carefully around sacred ground. The murmurs pulled Hannah Reeves from the edge of the crowd, a tall woman, 32, mixed Filipino and Irish heritage, an elementary school counselor with soft brown skin and long black hair drawn into a practical low ponytail, wearing a modest green dress and a denim jacket, eyes quick with empathy. She approached with a calm palm out, voice pitched to soothe, noteworthy for how often she could get fifth graders to drop clenched fists in hallways. And she said, "Hello there. Buddy, you're okay. We see you. What are you guarding?" And as she crouched, she noticed the ribbon attached to the disc. Faded red, white, and blue. A veteran in the gathering. Sergeant Paul Langley, 52, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper mustache. A thoughtful man with careful manners formed by deployments and hard lessons stepped forward and asked to take a look. And again the dog's rumble thrummed, but softer when Hannah remained close, as though the dog had accepted she could be the intermediary. Sergeant Langley squinted and said, "That's not just any medal. That's a bronze star." And a hush went through the parking lot like wind through wheat. Hannah whispered, "Whose is it?" And a teenager piped up that an older woman had lost something before service and seemed shaken. And as the crowd parted, the woman reappeared. Margaret, Maggie. Coleman, 76, slender, 5'5", white hair cropped neatly, pale freckled skin under a straw hat, wearing a navy cardigan over a floral dress, her hands and chin trembling, with a tender persistent grief sharpened by time. Widow of Corporal Jacob Coleman, fallen in Afghanistan 15 years earlier, a loss that had folded her life into quiet patterns of volunteer work and potluck casseroles and solitary evening walks. She pressed one hand to her chest when she saw the ribbon in the gravel and said I was pinning it to the message board for the Memorial Day outreach when it slipped from the shadow box. I thought I'd lost my last piece of him, and her knees wobbled. The dog turned his head toward her, as if he recognized a note in her voice, and inched aside just enough so that the metal lay visible, not to be taken, but to be seen. And when Maggie reached, he blocked again with that same gentle insistence. Hannah's eyes met the dog's, and she said softly, He's not keeping it from you. He's keeping watch until the right hands touch it. And because small towns lean toward meaning, people looked at one another and chose to believe the dog had come not by accident, but on duty, carrying a purpose tucked in his ribs like orders folded in a pocket. And as the church bell tolled the quarter hour, the mystery brightened the morning. Who was this dog? And how did he know to guard a fallen soldier's medal? Hannah coaxed the dog to the shade of a maple, using no more than presence and patience, a therapist's slow choreography, and the crowd reshaped into a respectful ring, while Sergeant Langley examined the medal from a foot away, describing the raised star, the laurel wreath, the inscription that would be on the reverse, careful not to touch, because the dog had established a perimeter that everyone honored. Maggie, though shaken, gathered herself with the kind of spine common to women who have written 1,000 grocery lists alone. And when Hannah invited her to sit, she declined with a graceful shake and said, "If this dog is guarding Jacob's medal, I'll stand as long as he needs me to," then lifted her chin toward the dog and said, "Thank you for your vigilance, soldier." The dog blinked, then looked to the church steps where a teen in a drumline t-shirt dropped to one knee as though he'd been asked to serve. The pastor came next, Reverend Caleb Warren, 40, black, clean-shaven, runner's build, high-kind cheekbones, and a steady gaze, a gentle leadership honed by hospital visits and kitchen table prayers, wearing a crisp white shirt and a charcoal tie, and he approached with shoes soft on the gravel, introduced himself, and asked the congregation to allow space. Caleb's younger sister, Detective Naomi Warren, 38, 5'7", athletic, hair in a tight bun, light brown skin, dressed in a Sunday blouse, but carrying in her posture the alert watchfulness of a city cop who has knocked on enough doors to know how to respect boundaries, stepped near and said, "Hannah, may I check for a collar? Any ID tag?" Permission hung in the air, like a held breath, and when Hannah extended her hand, the dog pushed his neck into her fingers, inviting a scratch that revealed a collar, but no tags, only a slot where one might have been. Naomi crouched, careful to keep her head lower than the dog's, murmured, "Hey, big guy. Anything on that chip?" And Sergeant Langley suggested the town's veterinarian, Dr. Ellis, could come with a scanner. Someone fetched him from the cafe across the street, where he was chewing on a muffin the size of a paperweight, and he arrived in rolled-up sleeves, mid-40s, sandy hair, courteous eyes, carrying a small handheld device and the firm, quiet competence that comes from lifting frightened animals without getting bitten. The scanner chirped, and the screen lit with a number string that Dr. Ellis recognized as registered, but not clearly assigned, and he said, "We'll need to call the chip service. But my hunch is he was once in a structured home, maybe trained, maybe someone's working dog." The dog had the bearing of one who had been trusted to make choices. Maggie lifted the ribbon end and asked if she might see the reverse, but again, the dog eased a paw onto the disc, gentle, insistent, and Hannah smiled in amazement, whispering, "He's protecting the story as much as the thing." So Maggie told them about the shadow box, how Jacob's bronze star had hung above her mantle beside a folded triangle of flag, a photo of him with a tousled grin beneath the desert sun, and the chaplain's letter that had described courage under fire in words that both soothed and seared. She'd brought the medal to pin it beside flyers for a fundraiser to repair the town's neglected war memorial, and somewhere between the vestibule and the corkboard, she'd fumbled the clasp, and it had fallen unseen to the parking lot. She had searched for 20 minutes, heart drumming out a panic so old it felt like a second pulse, before she was steered to her pew by kindly hands. And now this dog had found it, or rather, planted himself upon it, like a field cross. When Caleb asked for the chip line, Dr. Ellis dialed, recited the number, and frowned a little before brightening, saying, "Registered to a K-9 foster network that supports retired service dogs." And then the operator read a note. "Former military base companion animal, unofficially attached to a support program that paired dogs with soldiers between deployments. Name recorded as Buddy. Common, yes, but somehow perfect." Maggie pressed her mouth against her knuckles to steady herself and said Jacob always wanted a dog named Buddy. And the dog, Buddy, twitched an ear as if hearing his name in a remembered room. Detective Naomi asked softly whether Buddy might be waiting for orders from the nearest heart carrying Jacob's echo, and Caleb suggested a prayer. But before he could begin, Buddy stood for the first time, placed his nose gently against Maggie's wrist, then stepped back and sat, freeing the medal as if granting permission. The entire circle held still. Maggie picked up the bronze star, brushing dust from its face, turned it to the light, and on the reverse, the engraving flashed like a struck match. Coleman, Jacob H., and the gasp traveled in a widening ring, not just for the coincidence, but for the feeling, impossible to measure, that the dog had come to correct the world's tiny tilt, to guard the thin place where grief and gratitude met until the right hands arrived to hold it steady. The congregation slowly drifted back to their cars, but a core remained. Hannah, with her attentive stillness and protective humor, Naomi, with her detective's intuition, Caleb, with pastoral gravity, Sergeant Langley, with the veteran's habit of taking a perimeter, mentally, Dr. Ellis, with his scanner, now tucked into his pocket, Maggie, with both hands cupping the medal, like a warm bird, and Buddy with a sentinel's poise, now seated, but ready. A young boy edged forward from behind a minivan's shadow, 11 perhaps, skinny in a hand-me-down polo, mixed Latino and white family features, dark hair flopping into eyes that darted between curiosity and caution. His name was Leo Martinez, gentle soul, the kind of boy who said sorry to inanimate objects when he bumped them, living with his mother Elena after his father left for construction jobs and didn't come back, an absence that had taught Leo to walk softly and keep secrets. He knelt and whispered hi to Buddy, and Hannah noticed the boy's frayed backpack from which the corner of something wooden poked out. Naomi's eyes tracked it, and she asked softly what he had there, and Leo pulled free a small handcrafted box, imperfect but earnest, its lid carved with a star that had too many points, and yet somehow felt right. He said, "I made it in shop class for my grandma, but he swallowed. She passed last spring, and I didn't have a reason to finish the latch. And then when I saw the dog, I thought, maybe it's supposed to hold something for someone brave." Maggie's breath hitched, and she moved to hug the boy with a grandmother's instinct, but paused, remembering that grief sometimes startles children. So she simply nodded and asked, "May I see?" And Leo offered the box. Buddy rose, circled behind Leo, and placed his chin on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that stunned everyone with its tenderness. Naomi asked quietly whether Leo had seen Buddy before church, and Leo shrugged, said he had noticed the dog days ago, sleeping in the shade of the war memorial on the square, as if waiting, and yesterday he followed Leo to the church steps, then vanished, and this morning he was already here, when Leo arrived early to help set up folding chairs. That felt like a breadcrumb trail, and Langley mused that some dogs home themselves, to purpose instead of place. Caleb, hearing something almost liturgical in all of it, said sometimes callings are stitched from the world's loose threads. Dr. Ellis said Buddy looks healthy, but weary, muscles taut in a way that suggested he trotted miles, pads a little scuffed, coat carrying burrs from a hedge, and Hannah moved to gently pluck them, murmuring, "You did good work, pal." Maggie asked if the box might keep the medal safe while they planned a rededication at the memorial, and Leo, eyes shining, said, "Yes, I can fix the latch and sand the corners smooth." And Buddy's tail finally gave a small, measured thump. Naomi, ever the investigator gently probing, asked Maggie to tell a story about Jacob for Leo, and Maggie spoke about a boy with skinned knees who grew into a man with an easy laugh, who learned in the army that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to carry others while afraid. As she spoke, Buddy inched nearer until he could rest a paw atop Maggie's shoe, anchoring her to the present so the past would not sweep her away. The group decided they would house the medal temporarily in the church office safe. Then, with Leo's box completed, hold a riverside ceremony where veterans, families, and schoolchildren would gather. Caleb promised to ask the mayor for a permit. Naomi would coordinate with the sheriff's office for a respectful escort. Langley would reach the VFW, and Hannah would involve her students to write letters to service members. Buddy, hearing words that sounded like orders becoming real, lifted his head high and scanned the lot like a commander confirming the plan. Then, with sudden decisiveness, he trotted toward the entrance of the church, paused at the threshold, and turned to look at Maggie. She understood and followed, holding the medal, and together with Hannah and Naomi, they went inside, where sunlight, through stained glass, made rubies on the floor. Buddy led them to a bulletin board where the fundraiser flyer flapped on one pin, and he pressed his nose to the corner. Maggie pinned the medal's ribbon there, temporarily, for a photo, and Hannah snapped one, the dog seated like a statue, the medal bright and sure, Maggie's hand over her heart. When the photo captured, Buddy whined softly. Hannah returned the medal to Maggie's palms, and in that exchange, everyone felt the passing of a whisper, like orders issued at last. Protect the memory, lift the town, and make it safe for children to hope. In the days that followed, Cedar Creek reorganized itself around Buddy and the medal. The story sparked in classrooms, coffee shops, and the barber shop, with the striped pole that never stopped spinning. Hannah brought Buddy to the school lawn, where children sat crisscross applesauce, while she explained kindness through his calm, and the principal, Ms. O'Donnell, short, freckled, red-haired, and brisk with a heart of chamomile tea, arranged for Leo to present the finished box at the ceremony. Naomi ran a quiet check on the K-9 foster network and confirmed a transfer record from a closed base 2 states over where Buddy had accompanied soldiers to therapy sessions, learned to lay his head on shaking knees, and absorb storms. It made sense, then, that he would seek out grief to neutralize it, like a bomb tech with mercy. But small towns carry shadows along with light, and not everyone loved to see attention gather where their own needs went unmet. Namely, a man named Trent Avery, 49, compact build with a tightly shaved jaw and a clenched smile that never reached his pale eyes. A used truck dealer with a reputation for selling more payments than engines, wearing pressed jeans, pointed boots, and a cologne that tried too hard. Years earlier, he had been Jacob's classmate and rival in high school football, and he never quite forgave the way townsfolk spoke Jacob's name, with a warmth reserved for the truly decent. When Trent learned that the Riverside ceremony might bring a television crew, he saw an opportunity to reclaim attention by injecting himself as organizer. But when Caleb and Naomi declined his offer, saying they already had coordination covered, something sour festered. He parked his pickup near the War Memorial one afternoon and watched Buddy doze at its base, then tossed a hot dog into the grass to lure him away, only to find Buddy ignore it, like a soldier who knows to eat only from trusted hands. Trent snarled that the dog was just a stray with good timing. That night, someone peeled the fundraiser flyers from telephone poles, and Naomi, whose patience came furnished with steel, paid Trent a visit under the soft glow of his dealership's fairy lights, asked him about the flyers, and received a tight-lipped lecture about free country and overblown hero worship, to which Naomi responded, not with argument, but with a long, level stare that made most liars blink. Still, the next morning, 2 more flyers were torn. Caleb preached a sermon about humility that was not subtle and made Trent flush a color like bad ham. Meanwhile, Maggie, who had found a new kind of breath in her lungs after Buddy's guarding, baked bread and wrote note cards to the school children, and Sergeant Langley met with veterans who had stopped coming to meetings because the memories were too loud. Buddy moved through these scenes like a quiet metronome, keeping time for the town's collective heart. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the flats, and Buddy vanished. Panic lifted eyebrows and quickened feet as people spread out. Hannah checking the school gym. Leo pedaling his bike along the river path. Dr. Ellis behind the clinic. Naomi cruising streets with her window down in the rain. Until Leo spotted muddy paw prints leading behind the old feed store. There, under a canted tin awning, Buddy stood in front of a door ajar, body barricading a darker room. Growl, low and steady. Naomi arrived with a flashlight and found, inside, a small stack of stolen fundraiser flyers and a cardboard box containing a shadow box nearly identical to Maggie's, but smashed, glass cracked like a spiderweb, ribbon sliced. Naomi felt heat flood her chest, and she called Caleb and then Maggie, who arrived with a trembling hand to her mouth. Buddy didn't move from the threshold, wouldn't let anyone step farther. Naomi photographed everything and then gently asked Buddy to let her pass. He relented once Maggie placed her palm on his head and said, "Good boy. Thank you for holding the line." Naomi suspected the smashed box was a message meant to hurt Maggie. No physical blow, but a fracture aimed at memory. She followed a trail of muddy boot prints to where they vanished near the dealership's back fence. Later, when she asked Trent about trespass, he laughed and called it dramatic. Naomi filed an incident report anyway, not to escalate, but to document. And that evening, as the storm sighed its last and fireflies stitched green stitches in the dusk, Buddy returned to the church parking lot, lay down on the exact spot where he'd first found the medal, and slept, chin on paws, guarding a place as much as an object, while Maggie sat in the front pew alone and whispered to Jacob that the world had tried to break a box, but instead had proved that love could post guards in fur and heartbeat. The Saturday of the ceremony arrived with sun bright as brass and a breeze that smelled of cut grass and river water. The park's maples cast dappled gold, and the repaired war memorial shone with a fresh polish. Names newly legible, flags crisp and clean. Folding chairs faced a small platform where a podium and a microphone stood, and the whole town seemed present. Children with paper flags, veterans in caps embroidered with units, parents in their Sunday best, teenagers in band shirts, shopkeepers, farmers, nurses in scrubs-off night shift, and a handful of out-of-towners drawn by the story. Leo stood near the front clutching his finished box, now smooth, stained walnut, the star on its lid corrected to 5 points, a brass latch fitted snug. He wore a hand-pressed dress shirt, his hair combed into nervous obedience, and beside him Elena, his mother, a compact woman in her late 30s with dark eyes, brown skin warm under sun, shoulder-length hair in a tidy clip, a thrift store navy dress made elegant by her posture, pride and worry balanced like a tray in her chest. Hannah shepherded students into a semicircle, her green dress traded for a pale blue blouse and slacks, her posture the anchor of a day that could wobble for children. Caleb, in a navy suit, stood with Maggie and Langley, and Naomi in a tailored black blazer coordinated with Deputy Ruiz, a tall woman with an easy grin, and forearms that told the story of a life lifting both weights and people. Dr. Ellis waited with a stethoscope in his satchel, just in case Buddy tired. Speaking of Buddy, he padded in with a quiet majesty, fur groomed from a bath that Elena had insisted upon, nails trimmed, a simple ribbon of red, white, and blue, tied like a band at his collar. When he reached the platform steps, he paused, looked to Maggie, then to Leo, then to the box. Maggie opened her purse and took out the bronze star, its face reflecting a fragment of sky, and handed it to Leo, whose eyes widened until they seemed made of light. He opened the box and placed the medal inside on a bed of blue, felt he'd glued with care. The crowd drew a collective breath, the sort of inhalation that precedes applause, but belongs first to reverence. Caleb welcomed everyone and told the story, not embellishing and not understating, voice low and sure. And when he named Jacob, Maggie pressed the thin roll of programs to her lips. Langley spoke next about the meaning of service, his sentences paced like marching feet, and then Hannah invited her chorus of children to read letters. "Thank you for being brave," one read, and another said, "I will help my mom without being asked," and a third, in imperfect spelling, said, "I hope I can be a guard like Buddy." For someone who was sad, the line between ceremony and healing blurred, as it should. Naomi read the list of local soldiers lost, and her voice carried that measured resistance to breaking that only professionals practice. When it was Maggie's turn, she set her notes aside and spoke from a well she had both dreaded and needed to draw from. Jacob wore a grin like sunshine, she said, and loved the sound of baseball on a summer radio. He once stopped on the highway to carry a turtle across. When the notification came, I wanted to smash everything the way the enemy had smashed the world. But my hands found bread dough and note cards and the yoke of living, and for 15 years I held on. Then she looked at Buddy and said, "This good dog lay down on that metal like a shield." And I remembered Jacob's voice telling me to stand up again. So today, we stand. The crowd couldn't help it. The applause rose, then softened because Leo had stepped forward. He held out the box to Maggie, and she placed her fingers over his without taking it, and together they carried it to the memorial where a pedestal waited. Buddy followed and sat at attention, eyes on the box, tail still. Caleb gave a nod to Deputy Ruiz, who lifted a small cloth to reveal a bronze plaque newly mounted. "In honor of all who served, in memory of Corporal Jacob H. Coleman, guardian of this town's heart." The inscription's last line had been Maggie's insistence. No names of battles, only the truth of what service does for neighbors. As the cloth fell aside, the crowd saw that a shallow glass case had been added to the pedestal to hold Leo's box, locked but visible, and as the sun struck it, the blue felt turned the metal into a tiny star, afloat in daytime. Buddy exhaled and lowered onto his belly, like he was finally off shift. And then, to the surprise of many, a low rumble of engines approached. Not Trent Avery's trucks, but a convoy of motorcycles, veterans riders from 3 counties, flags streaming. They parked in a line and removed helmets, faces ranging from young to time-etched, women and men, and they saluted. Formal, crisp, bearing the dignity of those who have learned the cost of gesture. Maggie saluted back, and her hand didn't shake. Cameras clicked, but it didn't feel like spectacle. It felt like a town taking inventory of its soul and finding it sufficient. After the ceremony, as clusters formed around coolers and cookie trays, Trent Avery marched up with a face crafted for confrontation and said loudly to anyone who'd listen that the dog and the medal had been an overplayed sob story, that real stories were about people who built businesses, not sentimental mutts. Naomi stepped between him and the pedestal with the simple authority of someone who had found broken things and refused to leave them that way. She said, "Trent, take the day off from bitterness." And when he muttered back, Buddy stood, moved forward, and placed himself in front of Naomi, not snarling, not baring teeth, just existing as a wall, made of fur and certainty. Something in that peaceful blockade humiliated Trent more than any argument. He spun on his heel and strode to his truck, and as he jerked the door, the crowd fell silent, because Deputy Ruiz had walked up with a citation for defacement of public postings. Not an arrest, just a consequence. His cheeks flamed. He drove off too fast and within 2 blocks, stalled, then coasted to the shoulder, because as Naomi liked to say, karma sometimes hires a mechanic. Meanwhile, Leo tried to thank Buddy by offering him a slice of ham lovingly wrapped in a napkin, and Buddy took it with a delicate mouth, then licked the boy's wrist as if sealing a pact. Dr. Ellis gave Buddy a full exam that afternoon and confirmed he was healthy, only tired. He offered to formalize Buddy's adoption under the town's care, with Maggie as primary steward and Hannah as secondary. 2 homes, but 1 circle. Caleb planned a rotation of volunteers to walk him, Leo signing up for the Saturday morning slot with a seriousness that made Elena smile and dab her eye. And as the sun drifted to late afternoon, Maggie sat on a bench under the maple and patted the spot beside her. Buddy hopped up, awkward and careful, and curled against her leg. She stroked the coarse fur and said, "You found what I dropped and what I feared I had lost for good. Not just a medal, but the courage to bear it." Buddy's eyes half closed, then flicked open toward the river. A boy's shout, happy, not scared, and the thud of a canoe bumping the shore made him lift his head, but not tense. The town breathed easy, but what the dog knew was this: grief leaves gaps that responsibility can step into, and if you lie down across those gaps long enough, people will find ways to build bridges. Days later, Naomi received a call from the K9 foster network confirming that Buddy's original handler, a counselor on base, had passed away, and that Buddy had slipped his temporary foster yard weeks earlier, then traveled, following who knows what scent, motor oil and hymnals, Jacob's name etched in bronze, the salt in Maggie's tears, the bacon somebody fried on Maple Street, or simply the magnetic pull of a place that needed him. She shared this gently with Maggie and Caleb and Hannah, and they all agreed not to burden Buddy with the past, but to honor him with the present. The town raised enough funds to maintain the memorial for years. Leo earned a woodworking scholarship from a regional guild that had seen a clip of him speaking, and when he accepted, he said he wanted to build cases for museums where kids could see the stories their grandparents had lived. Trent sold his dealership 2 months later and bought a fishing boat that taught him the art of listening to water instead of engines. Hannah's students started a kindness patrol that left chalk messages on sidewalks. Langley returned to meetings and helped 3 younger vets enroll in counseling. Caleb baptized 2 teenagers in the river who said the ceremony had made them believe that love could build structures you can stand on. And Maggie kept the key to the pedestal case on a necklace, a small silver token that felt warm against her skin. On warm mornings, Buddy would trot from the parsonage yard, where he slept, to the memorial and lie down facing the case, not out of worry, but as if to remind the town to keep watch too. Sometimes a child would sit with him and read a comic book aloud. Sometimes an old man would tell him about the choir back in '67. Sometimes Elena would bring a thermos of coffee and add a splash to the earth for the absent. Every now and then, Maggie would kneel and whisper Jacob's name into Buddy's soft ear, and Buddy would lift his head and gaze at her with an expression that said he knew the mission and that it was ongoing. On the anniversary of the ceremony, the town gathered again, and when the mayor asked if anyone had words, Leo stepped up taller, voice stronger, and said, A dog taught us how to guard what matters, and we're better because we obeyed." The crowd laughed softly at obeyed, then cheered. As the sky lifted into noon blue and leaves whispered, Buddy closed his eyes and let the sunlight fill his old bones, content because the medal was secure, the story redeemed, and the people were, at last, standing the watch together.